So please welcome for our opening address, and with lots of hats on, I think, from the Local Government Association, Buckinghamshire County Council, England's Economic Heartland, please welcome Councillor Martin Tett.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to be here. It's also very interesting to see who are the hardened souls who've managed to, A, find their way here. You didn't need to lead a trail of breadcrumbs or whatever from the hotel to get here, but also actually after what sounded like a really convivial night last night, have actually managed to get up early enough in the morning to come here and hear the opening speeches. So well done. You're my heroes, I have to say, and heroines, so fantastic job. I'm wearing many hats here, and I've got a lot of scope to cover. I am, as Richard said, first of all, leader of Buckinghamshire County Council. I'm also chairman of the Alliance of Local Authorities that stretches between Oxford and Cambridge, known as England's Economic Heartland. And I'm also chairman of the Local Government Association's longest acronym. That is the Economy, Environment, Housing and Transport Board. That looks very much at a national perspective, and this is probably one of the biggest topics that actually concerns the LGA as well, the whole issue of securing not just current but future funding into our local roads and highways. I call this speech the road to tomorrow, because in some ways it's about what we do today, but it's also about how we then secure that road into the future, so that actually what we're building is a sustainable network of transportation that will last us not just where we are today and for the next few years, but actually for the next 20, 30, 50 years into the future. And that's quite a challenge. I've got a lot to cover. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. If anyone wants to pick up some of these points afterwards with me, that would be brilliant as well. Probably a superficial slide here for many people in the audience, like why are roads important? But actually for me, there's two key messages here. First of all, it's not just about tarmac, it's not just about roads. This is about highways and transportation is more than just roads. It's about very much the sustainable transport of the future. It's about rail, it's about cycleways, footways and so on. And it's also increasingly about the internet. It's absolutely about the new means of communication and transportation for people, which is actually about the way we communicate across distances. And for me, the capability to have not just high speed, but ultra-fast broadband, and not just to a fixed point, but to a mobile point, because we're all working off our phones now, is absolutely fundamental to that. And it has two fundamental key reasons for existence, I think. First of all, the economic. This country's economy could not work without good transportation and good highways. It's like saying that you have a body but no heart and no veins and no arteries, because the blood just wouldn't pump around the system. Companies have got to reach their suppliers, they've got to reach their customers, their workers have got to get to work, they've got to get home from work. The whole economic mechanism relies on that. And as a local authority, if we didn't have businesses, then we wouldn't have the money to actually pay for the roads of the future. This is self-interest as much as anything. And secondly, there's a really big social point here, because if we don't have really good transportation mechanisms, and that can include local buses as well, then actually the risk of social isolation becomes very great, particularly for the increasingly elderly population that we have. It's young people getting to school and home again. It's people getting out and socialising. There's an immense social cost associated with good transport infrastructure too, and governments and local authorities neglect that at their peril. So let's look at where we are in terms of the current state of our roads. And I'm going to focus mainly on roads at this point. I'm going to move on to the other transport later on. First of all, traffic volumes, they're big and they're increasing. I put up Buckinghamshire here just for an example. We're obviously between London and the Midlands. We're looking at the West Country. We're looking at the M40, M4. We have a very high density of transport going through Buckinghamshire. But you'll see the transport volumes across the country are very high. But importantly, the growth in the volumes is also very high. What we're seeing is a rate of growth of something like 5% every 10 years. It's over 10% since the year 2000, and that rate, if is anything, likely to increase in the years ahead in a do-nothing scenario. So we actually have to be looking at how we're investing in our roads to maintain the existing roads for the years ahead. And there's also, quite importantly, a change in the way they're being used. Because historically it's been car usage, but increasingly what we're seeing now is the massive growth in the light van. And if you think about it, it's pretty obvious, because as you look at the decline of the high street and the mass move towards online shopping, so much of that online shopping is now being distributed and delivered via those light vans. So the big HGVs delivered to large central warehouses, but the distribution from them via the whole logistics chain down to the individual consumer is increasingly through light vans. And they are becoming a major factor on our roads. Now, what I did say is that the investment in our roads from central government is just not keeping up with that growth of traffic. Now, some of the work the LGA has done has shown, that actually we need a substantial investment in our roads going forward, and that's not just the major roads, the strategic roads, but it's the local and the major roads network as well. But even the roads, even the government's own road investment strategy has said, and I'm going to quote this, that by 2040, congestion on the strategic roads network alone will actually cost £28 million in terms of lost working days. That's 16 hours a year to the average family, just stuck somewhere on a motorway or a strategic road. And that's with the current planned level of investment. So our roads, as they are, the trajectory forward is they're just going to get more and more congested, and that frustration for both individual residents, but for businesses will continue to grow. And I think it's a massive challenge for government and for local authorities. But also let's look at the condition of that road network, because it's a very mixed picture. What you see actually when you look at this is that government data actually is quite flawed. It doesn't actually capture an awful lot of the condition of roads. It tends to look at the major roads, the strategic roads, and we see a slowly, steady, suppose, improvement on those. But when you look at the fact that 82% of roads are actually local roads, they're the roads that you and I live in, they're the roads that we use, quite frankly, as rat runs to get to and from work. The condition of those is not in anything like as good condition. And actually, if anything, according to my residents, certainly, they are actually declining because of the lack of investment in those roads. And they're very susceptible to winter pressures. You'll have noticed, anyone who just lived through the beast from the east last year will know that actually we took a heck of a pounding from that bad weather towards the end of the winter. It was wet as a winter, you get the freezing overnights, and then you get that beast from the east come in, and our roads were just shot to blazes. And the deluge of emails that people like Richard and I get just start to pour in. And people forget the investment you put in the roads historically. For them, the reality is the fact they've just hit a pothole, they've burst a tyre, they've broken their axle or whatever, and the claim comes into the local authority. And there's aggravation. So for them, the condition of our roads is paramount, and it is not perceived to be getting better by residents. That is a key factor. Now, what about government funding? Because if we're going to improve the condition of local roads, then it's absolutely important that local authorities get the money to do that. And the reality is that funding from government is actually pretty static. It's not going up. And there's two key flaws in that. First of all, inflation is just eroding the value of that grant all the time. And secondly, of course, it doesn't just cover roads. It covers a multiplicity of other local highway responsibilities. Now, we've just spent a fortune on repairing a very ancient bridge in Buckinghamshire. That just sucks up money. That's money that's not then available to actually improve or maintain the roads that we've got. Now, I'm told by our professionals that actually we need to be spending in excess of 12 million a year capital just to maintain the existing roads in decent condition. That doesn't take into account the new roads that are constantly being built in the county. We can barely maintain that on the government grant. So we're not going to be improving the roads realistically, which is why we're one of the very few counties that does this, we actually increase the amount the government gives us. We do what's called a revenue contribution to capital. We actually take council tax money and we spend it on capital to improve the roads. So we've never spent less than 15 million a year since 2011, and we've quite often spent higher than that, 18 or even 25 million. And even that, candidly, our residents tell us just isn't enough. It's a very, very, very slow crawl out of a deep pit in terms of highway condition. And every time you get a bad winter, it just knocks you back down again. And residents don't remember the roads that you improved. They all remember the roads that fell apart that winter. So, trust me, this is a really tough job at the moment. One of the things that then comes through as to councils like my own is resident dissatisfaction. You'll know from just talking to your neighbours, talking to the pub, wherever you socialise, that actually residents hate local roads. They absolutely hate them. They blame the council. It's always the council. It doesn't matter which council. It's always the council. Yeah. Very rarely central government, interestingly enough. So when you look at some of the surveys that are done, what you'll find is actually that the resident satisfaction with roads, if anything, is declining. And in fact, I find that even the more money you spend on local roads, quite often it leads to higher rates of dissatisfaction. Because when you do one road, the first thing that I get is every road in the area then write in saying, why did you do their road, not mine? And then you raise expectations, because when every road is bad, people just sort of expect it. When you start to improve some, actually then you find that residents say, well, why not mine as well? And they become more and more dissatisfied. And they're also dissatisfied with the fact that quite often, and almost every council does this, we repair one pothole. Quite often it's an emergency repair. We go along, there's a little bit of tarmac stuck in, somebody seems to stamp it down with their feet. The resident sees that. What they see is that within a couple of weeks, that plug has come out. And they'll also see that all the potholes around it, which are actually not as bad, are then also not repaired. And that makes people absolutely furious. Because nobody understands that if you're doing every little pothole in that area, you're not mending the priority ones elsewhere. What they see is you're doing a shoddy job, you're wasting the council taxpayers' money, and actually it's just not going to last. You raise the angst. But this is a challenge we all face as local councils. And the impact of poor roads is felt by everybody. It's felt by residents in terms of the damage to their cars. The question going forward is, if we don't sort this out, we don't sort it out now, what's going to happen to the next generation of vehicles that come along? When we start to get the electric vehicles, but also the driverless vehicles that are predicted within the next 10, 20 years or so, how are they going to cope with roads that, quite frankly, are just barely fit for purpose for modern vehicles? We've actually really got to strategically address the condition of our roads. So, is government listening? I guess is one of the questions. Well, I think you're going to have a presentation later on that's going to also talk about the budget. As a local government association, one of the things we've been doing really actively is lobbying government on the whole funding situation. And I know Jesse Norman was here yesterday. I've met Jesse on a number of occasions to talk about the need for a 5-year strategic settlement for local authorities. What is useless for local councils is erratic funding year by year, where we just live effectively just waiting for the next announcement. What we need to know is what's a really good, sustainable level of funding going forward. And that's something the National Infrastructure Commission has called for as well. What we want to see is the same sort of pattern of funding for local authorities as is given to people like Network Rail, Highways England and so on, which means we can do strategic contracts, we can have 5-year rolling plans, we can really maximise the value we get from the government money. At the moment, what we get is the sort of panic reaction when there's been a bad winter, or dare I say it, maybe just coincidentally an election coming up. Suddenly there'll be this sudden dollop of money that comes from government. And it's great when we get it, but we're told, hey, there's 420 million extra funding for potholes, great. And by the way, please spend it by the end of March. Hang on, that's going to be quite tricky. So you can't really react properly and plan ahead and do a proper asset-based approach when you get these sort of knee-jerk panic reactions. So my plea to government consistently through the LGA is, first of all, let's have that 5-year settlement. Let's plan this properly and professionally. Secondly, one of the things you'll see from this slide is that there's actually across the country as a whole a massive, massive maintenance backlog. This is not trivial. The LGA estimates it is over £9 billion in terms of the deficit that's required to actually make up the condition of our roads. And that's not every road being like a bowling green. This is getting roads to an acceptable standard. Now, no one expects government to cough up £9 billion, unless you happen to be the NHS, I guess. This is actually a really large amount of money that needs to be put in consistently over a period of time. So the argument we get back from government is, where's the money going to come from? Where's the magic money tree? And what we've argued with government, again, pretty consistently as the Local Government Association, is the money is there if you look at the whole issue of fuel duty. I mean, people pay, motorists predominantly pay the fuel duty. We all hate paying it, but it's a lot of money. And actually, I don't think most motorists would actually object if a small amount, and I'm talking about 1 or 2 pence per gallon, actually went towards maintaining and improving the quality of the roads. So, for example, you could actually bring in an extra $1 billion a year to local authorities. That's over twice what the government's just announced in the budget, if we actually just put 1 or 2 pence extra on the price of petrol, or just substituted the existing fuel duty. So that money could be made available, and I actually don't think there'd be too much resistance from motorists if the government was prepared to do that. But at the moment, they're resistant to that. I think they need to bite the bullet on this. And the other thing I'd make a plea for, wearing my LGA hat, is there is such a multiplicity of funding streams. The Local Government Association has identified something like 11 different funding streams that come to local authorities in connection with highways. And it's really confusing. Some of these are grants, some of them are bids. Some are 1 year, some are ongoing. It's just a muddle, quite frankly. And if we can actually get to the stage where actually what they do is simplify all of these, coalesce them into one, maybe two funding streams. So again, we knew what we were going to get, and we didn't have to spend an awful lot of time and money bidding for money, and we actually could spend that time and money getting the roads sorted out. I think that would be a major step forward. So why don't local authorities spend more of their own money? What I hear from when I knock on residents' doors, canvassing at election time. Look at the state of the roads. What are you doing with my council tax? I pay over £2,000 a year, they say. Where's it going? I reported that pothole at 10 o'clock and it still hasn't been fixed. The reality is, when you're in local authorities, we're facing some really difficult choices at the moment. Local council funding has been cut dramatically over the last 10 years. We are finding it a really tough time at the moment. And you'd have seen that if you listen to radio or television. So one of the big choices we're facing is the opportunity cost, as it's called, between the spending on what are key statutory services, particularly children's services and adult social care, and spending on everything else. And that includes spending on our roads. So, for example, we have Ofsted, who are knocking on the door of virtually every council in the country saying, children's services, not good enough. You need to effectively spend more on children's services. We have a growing population of young people, and particularly linked to determinants like deprivation. That pressure is just growing all the time, and rising public expectations. At the other end of the scale, there's an increasingly elderly population, which is again putting immense pressure on local authorities, because I think we have a social responsibility to look after our elderly. But the cost of that can be absolutely enormous. Now, about 8 years ago, the London Borough of Barnet developed something you may well have heard of, the Barnet Graph of Doom. The Barnet Graph of Doom basically said, given no change, local authorities' expenditure will just be devoured by the growing pressures from adults and children's social care. And it will just devour, like a Pac-Man, everything else. At the time, the Secretary of State, a guy called Eric Pickles, scoffed at that and said that was ridiculous. That is coming true. If you just look at my own authority, just in the last couple of years, the spending on social care has gone from 46 to 63%. By the end of our current budgeting period, that will be nearly 70% on social care, if there is no change. And that is just devouring everything else. So what's the future going to hold? Because we need to make sure that what we're doing is actually sustainable going forward. What people complain about at the moment is the state of existing roads. It's where they live. But actually, we're building more and more houses. The government has a target of building 300,000 new houses a year. That's an increase in the amount of road network all the time. So we need to actually think about how we're going to be funding not just repairing existing roads, but that new growing network. But then look beyond that, because the government's ambition is not just the houses that are in the existing local plans. They want to see a step change. They want to see massive growth in areas like the heartlands. Now, I'm a supporter of growth in the heartlands. I think we can actually double or even treble the national contribution to the UK's GVA through the heartlands between Oxford and Cambridge. But I absolutely believe that cannot, first of all, be at the expense of the maintenance of existing roads. It cannot also be just business as usual for the new houses that are being built, just relying on Section 106 or SIL to actually put in place the infrastructure. Because we all know there's just not enough money in the system to do that from those sort of contributions. If you want to see big new towns, new settlements built along that corridor, they've got to be linked. They've got to be linked down to Heathrow, if you're an international business. They've got to be linked to Luton Airport. They've got to be linked to Birmingham and the West Midlands. They've got to be linked to the M4 corridor. They've got to be linked to the M40. They've got to actually provide the sustainable environment that all businesses need and residents need. It's going to be like saying, I've built you a new heart, but actually all your arteries and veins are blocked. You've got to actually invest in that infrastructure. And it's not just the roads infrastructure. Going alongside that, you've got to have all the social infrastructure too, whether it's health, libraries, parks, and so on. So for me, the challenge I keep making to government, and I'm making it here again today, is don't just think that you've done your job when you invest billions in, say, East West Rail or the Expressway. It's the whole picture. You've actually got to invest in that whole environmental ecosystem for sustainability, which covers our roads, but covers everything that makes social life actually sustainable and worthwhile. We've just shown up here that network between Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, that's the That's the Brain Belt, or whatever title you want to call it. We call it the Heartlands. East-West Rail, clearly a commitment from government, but crossing here as well, HS2, but no station. Bizarre. You've got the expressway corridor, but they'll be consulting soon on what route. And the proposal from government, as I said, for a whole mass of new housing, potentially to go in there. But where is that investment going to come from, and is government really committed to that? Because I've been in discussion on growth deals with government recently, and they've done a deal for Oxfordshire, they've done one for Cambridgeshire, but for Northamptonshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire and Bedfordshire at the moment, there is no current prospect of any deals for any extra funding in that area, and I think that's a major challenge. And it's not just about roads, as I said. You've got to think also about the digital infrastructure. You've got to think about the utilities. And one of the biggest blocks to things like house building is actually making sure you've got the infrastructure in the ground, which includes gas, electricity. I've seen major housing estates held up, major housing estates held up, because there's just no electric supply in the area. We need to see regulation in the law change to allow utilities to invest up front. So we need that infrastructure in the round. So we've got the spending review coming up, and I guess this is now, what was in my generation the 7th Cavalry. Yeah, probably means not a lot to some younger people in the audience, but fundamentally what we're now pinning all our hopes on, and I'm lobbying government on wearing my LGA hat, is we've got a spending review coming up. The budget has delivered a one-off. I'm not ungrateful for that. I think that's been good, but we haven't got much time to spend that. But we need that consistency of investment in all local roads, a 5-year rolling commitment there, consolidation of those spending envelopes that come down, all that confusion, but also major investment into our new big strategic growth areas. Is the government going to step up to the plate on that? Because I think that's the real challenge. So, the spending review is next spring. I'm assuming it's going to be Philip Hammond, but hey, who knows? But whoever is Chancellor has really got to put on their thinking caps if they're going to deliver the sort of funding we're going to need to rise to the challenge. And one of the things I would say is that there are 3 big things they could deliver, particularly for the heartlands, but I think it applies to major growth areas around the country. First of all, is to work with local authorities to put in place what we call a national policy statement. It's very similar to what they've done now for Heathrow. This is for the strategic infrastructure that's going to be required in the growth areas. And that means that local authorities, but also private investment, but also colleagues, other stakeholders, strategic partners, like many of you in the room today, can actually commit to invest in these areas, secure in the knowledge that that government commitment is not just a one-off, it's not just a flavour of the month. Secondly, we need a major schemes development fund, because one of the big problems local authorities have is it's really expensive bidding for a lot of these funding streams. We have to employ extra staff, quite often bring in consultants, consultancies and so on. We no longer have the money to do that, is the reality of it. So we need help from government to fund that development, to actually get those bids in. And thirdly, as I've said, we really do need an indicative funding envelope stretching over many years so that we can have an honest conversation. And it's never going to give us everything we want, let me be frank, I understand that. But we can have an honest conversation with government and other stakeholders about what the trade-offs are within those particular envelopes. So then just looking to the future as my round-off on this, I've said I wanted to look at where we are today. I wanted to look at where we are moving towards, given the government's commitment, particularly on economic growth and on housing. But there are also some other interference factors, disruptors, coming across this. Everybody will be aware of the issues of climate change and air quality, becoming major issues, becoming major political issues. DEFRA, Michael Gove, very much interested in this. Local authorities coming under immense pressure on air quality. EU directives on air quality, which will be vied into UK law. We have that commitment. How do we rise to that challenge? Is it just by building more roads like we have in the past? What are we going to do about the growth and requirement for digital infrastructure? And as I said, it's not just fibre. It's not even just high-speed fibre. I'm not just talking about a few megabits or even gigabits. I'm talking about terabytes. How do we actually put in place that infrastructure? How do we make sure that when we build strategic infrastructure like railways and roads and so on, we put big, fat fibre pipes down them that actually the mobile companies and the internet companies have access to? Because at the moment, that is just not there. And what are we doing also about societal trends? One of the things I really notice having children now in their early 20s is they don't think in the same way that we did. They don't think about work as somewhere you go to. They think about work as something you do. And they don't just do it in a fixed place. They do it where they are. My son-in-law, he works from our dining room. Try to get him out, but he's still working in there. Right? When he comes, he sets up his office there. Yeah. He can travel around from Tallahassee to Denver to Los Angeles to Amersham, right? And that's his office. That's where he works. How do we think about those changes in society? And the fact that so many young people now are not taking driving tests. They're actually sharing cars. They're looking forward to a future where you have Uber driverless cars. How's that going to factor into this? So I think the challenge, quite frankly, as we look at this, is are we building the roads and the highways and the superhighways of the future? Or are we still too fixated on building the roads of the past? And are we going to really rise to the challenge of understanding what we're going to need in the year 2050 and no, not what we did need in 1950? I think there's some really big challenges out there. I think we collectively are going to rise to that challenge. And I really would like to work with you and with government in making sure we get this right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.